Now, it is Monday morning, so let us say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, very good morning to you. How are you?
Morning.
Well, what can I say? Let's talk a bit about the BBC, first of all, because you were talking about your kind of commensurate colleague, Mr. Andrew Marr, who you used to write a column in the same newspaper as, when you and he were considered to be sort of, I suppose, opposite sides of a particular political spectrum. And you made a couple of interesting asides about that. But also, what do you make of the way that they've been conducting themselves since Friday, since the whole Lord Dyson report kind of came out and was produced into a Panorama investigation?
The BBC is a completely out of control institution. It reminds me, above all things, of the medieval church. Hugely powerful, impossible to criticise, in charge of all its own self-discipline, effectively running its own courts, deciding its own priorities, deciding whether it's done wrong or right. You remember the Bashir business was actually exposed, first of all, in the Mail on Sunday in April 1996, a quarter of a century ago.
Yeah.
And it's taken that long for anything serious to be done or acknowledged about the whole way in which Martin Bashir and indeed many executives behaved. And this isn't an issue particularly close to my heart, but it shows you just how unresponsive and uncontrollable an organisation this is. Now, I often write about the BBC because it seems to me to show all the time a blatant bias towards the metropolitan liberal elite in everything it says and does. But I also subject myself to what an ordinary citizen would have to do if he wanted to complain or she wanted to complain. I put in complaints about programmes which are particularly outrageous. And first of all, you hit the sort of spongy outer surface, which is run by Capita, where your complaint is basically bunged back at you with the note saying, "Tough luck, Buster."
Yeah.
And then if you know enough to get past that and complain about the way your complaint has been treated, you eventually get to a body called the Executive Complaints Unit, which will eventually tell you to shove off.
Right.
And after that, you can go to Ofcom, which will say exactly what the BBC says. Not surprising, as we now learn that Ofcom, certainly until recently, had a major BBC person in charge of regulating the BBC.
Yeah.
So there is talk about judge and jury in your own case. There isn't anything anybody can do about it. Whatever it does, whether it's biased or behaves badly or stupidly or wrongly or incompetently, there isn't any way of controlling it. Well, there's only one thing you can do about an institution that's become that bad and that overmighty, and that is to cut it down to size. The other thing, it's legally bound to do something it doesn't do. And the Charter and Agreement, under which it gets the licence fee, obliges it to be impartial on major issues of controversy. It just isn't.
No.
Any serious government would simply would compile a report on the number of times it's failed in that duty and say, right, well, in that case, either you correct this within a set period of time, or the licence fee goes and we'll set up a new organisation with a charter which will replace you, which is often the only way to deal with things of this kind, just to replace them with something else or something better. I think we should have a national broadcaster. I actually believe the licence fee used to be, I'm not sure it can anymore, used to be quite a good way of raising money for such a broadcaster. We don't have a national broadcaster. We have an Islington broadcaster.
Yes.
And
But
I really
also,
don't see why the people of Sunderland should pay for an Islington broadcaster.
no, quite. And this is the thing, isn't it? Because, I mean, even in our lifetimes, the idea of the BBC, when I was growing up and watching it in the 1960s, was a very different idea to the one that we now are presented with. Because in those days, you had BBC. I remember when BBC Two started, it was like a revolution. Suddenly there was 2 channels. It was like, my goodness me, isn't it great? And then they sort of just grew exponentially into this huge digital operation, studios that they run, in which they commission vastly expensive costume dramas. They consume money in a way that no other broadcaster does, because they don't have any restrictions on how much they can spend. They can do things that news where I work can't do, and where Associated Newspapers where you work can't do, because the accountants would say, well, that's simply not viable. You just can't do that. And they've got all these radio stations, they've got the internet now, they've got BBC World, they've got BBC News Channel, they've got BBC Three, which was meant to have been shut down but somehow still is running, BBC Four. I mean, it just goes on and on.
Yes, and the thing is that given how much they have to spend on it, it really ought to be a lot better, oughtn't it?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, there's not
It's
much
being
of it that's any
trapped in a
good.
room with any one of those channels. So with BBC News, I'm a news-hungry person. I used to watch all the news bulletins that came along and listen to all the radio ones as well. I can't be bothered to watch BBC News most of the time anymore. After about 90 seconds, you think, well, just drivel.
Yeah.
It's propaganda in most cases, and you just turn it off and try and find some other source of information. It isn't good. That's the other thing. A lot of it used to be good. The output, the drama and the comedy and the documentaries were good, and now they're not. But there isn't anybody there to say these things aren't any good anymore, and it's a closed world, and it's extraordinary. I've often said that the people in the BBC are as conscious as a goldfish is of being in a bowl, that they are biased, or that there's anything wrong with them. This ridiculous Andrew Marr complaint at some Scottish book festival last week that he felt that he was constrained by the BBC and he couldn't speak out. I couldn't help but remember in the bizarre period when Rosie Boycott, possibly the most unlikely editor the Daily Express ever had, bless her, was in charge.
Yes.
He and they were both columnists on that paper.
Right. Well, you managed to survive. You managed to survive her editorship. I was fired.
I got on very well with Rosie.
I was fired by Rosie Boycott for not being a woman.
Oh, well, I suppose. I mean, this didn't happen to me. What did I do wrong? But I can only sympathise. But no, she was always very nice to me, and I liked her, and I continue to like her. But there it was. There was Andrew Marr running this column. He once devoted an entire page to attacking my position on the euro.
Right.
And at the same time, he was writing columns for the Observer. Which were perhaps even more Blairite than the ones he was writing for the Daily Express. And the thing is that here I am. I can barely get on the BBC now because I'm such a bad person.
Yes.
As far as they're concerned. And I hear from people I know in the BBC that my name has come up for various things and been immediately vetoed without any need for argument. This is the reaction which comes. But Andrew is in charge of one of the most important programmes on the corporation. And how is it that he is impartial and I'm not, when both of us were taking strongly partial positions publicly in a national newspaper, 30 years ago?
Yeah.
Has he undergone some strange re-impartialization process? Was there an operation he had to undergo?
Yeah.
I don't believe so. It's just yet another illustration of the fact that BBC impartiality is complete rubbish. It doesn't exist. The BBC is an organisation of the left, and it has been for many, many decades.
Because they also talk about Andrew Marr in these sort of hushed tones that he came from the world of newspapers. Therefore, he's a proper journalist. You know, unlike you, who also came from the world of newspapers and is a proper journalist.
Yeah, so of course they have a problem. They could say, "Oh, well, yeah, but Peter Hitchens, he was only from the sort of knuckles brushing the ground tabloid press." Except so was Andrew Marr.
I know, it really is quite.
He and I were both on the same knuckles brushing the ground tabloid newspaper, so that one won't work either. But I don't in any way denigrate Andrew's journalistic career and achievements. They're considerable, but. I could point to a fair amount of stuff on my own part. So it's not as if I haven't done anything, but it's so obvious that the reason people like me don't get anywhere near anything important in the BBC, and the important jobs in the BBC, the presenters' jobs, is because of my politics.
And that's absolutely right, because it turns out that as they are clearly of a mind to try and avoid any massive change, it seems to me that they're very good at kicking things into the long grass. You know, I mean, all sorts. I mean, Prince William himself has asked for an investigation of one kind or another. You would think that the parliamentary committees would want to have at least a session with the BBC chief executives and the board of management and all the rest of it to ask them how this could have happened. Even if they were just going through the motions. But of course, Sir Keir Starmer, who was very keen on launching dawn raids against journalists from various tabloid newspapers from the Murdoch empire, seems to have gone very quiet on this one. He doesn't seem to care so much about the BBC.
Well, Parliament has a difficulty. You really don't want the government controlling a major broadcasting organisation directly or indirectly. And I can see there's a difficulty there with how far you can go, which is why I concentrate so much on the whole basis of the BBC's constitution. Which is easy to read and find, which is the charter and agreement, which is the basis on which the licence fee is collected. And all the government needs to say is, no, you're not doing this. You're simply not. You're not. And evidence is easily produced. You're not on man-made, climate change, on the COVID issue, on almost any major issue of public policy, from drug legalization to abortion. The BBC is clearly partial on many major issues of public controversy. It's the views that it holds are perfectly reasonable views which ought to be expressed and given a platform. But what they don't do is provide a platform to those who have different opinions to theirs. And that is a failure, a straightforward failure to observe the Charter and Agreement. Well, they should be, as I say, given time, explain to them, these poor goldfish going round and round in their bowl, what it is that they are doing and why it is wrong. And they should be given, I suspect, a year to put it right. And if they won't put it right, then then a new organisation should be set up to fulfil the whole idea of having a British Broadcasting Corporation. It's not as if it's like the railways. I mean, the equipment is all paid for by the licence payer. It could simply be transferred to a new organisation which was willing to behave itself. I'm not one of those who wants to defund the BBC and not have any public service broadcasting. It seems to me, if you look at the United States, that big private broadcasters are in general just as much leaning to the left as the BBC. And that wouldn't be a solution.
Well, they are now, but they didn't used to be. I mean, when I lived in the States back in the sort of 80s and early 90s, NBC, CBS, and ABC were pretty straightforward news. Certainly, as news organisations, they were pretty.
I didn't think so. I'm afraid.
You really? Did you not?
I'd switch on the nightly news with Peter Jennings or whoever it was. I know. Here it comes. But perhaps I've always been more savagely right-wing than you and more sensitive to these things. But I never thought so. And the comedy and drama output was similarly tended in the generally liberal cultural direction. I don't think that you can really make an argument that privately owned broadcasting is axiomatically going to be more conservative than public service broadcasting. It's not borne out.
Well, I suppose not, except for the fact that now the most successful network in the US is Fox, and Fox became very much more the opposite of all of those things that you're describing.
Fox, I'm sorry, but I think Fox is a caricature of what if you have to have. My view is that any broadcaster to be serious has to be adversarial inside. It has to allow both views to contain.
No, I agree with that. I totally agree with that. Well, Andrew Neil, funnily enough, said the same thing. He said he'd just been to America, I think it was a couple of years ago, and he said, I watched a political talk show on NBC where they had 4 people who hated Donald Trump all discussing how they hated him, and then on Fox they had 4 other people who all loved Trump and discussing how they loved him. So how about you put the two together and make a proper show?
Well, of course, and that's what they didn't do. But I thought if Fox had just said, right, well, all the others are to the left and we're to the right, I think they could have set a far better example and behaved and continue to behave much more responsibly. I always thought Fox was a caricature of what a proper conservative.
Well, that may be your view, but it is. But what I'm saying is, it doesn't follow your example that private companies cannot be conservative in the way that they broadcast, because they do, and whether you don't like what they do is another matter.
Would you say that Fox was particularly socially or morally conservative?
I would say yes, it is.
Much more Thatcherite or Reaganite, but I wouldn't have thought it was an influence for moral conservatism much.
Well, it certainly created a moral conservative movement and augmented it to the point where Donald Trump was elected to the White House on that platform.
He certainly isn't a moral conservative, is he? I mean, just look at him. This is where the confusion lies. I mean,
maybe I'm not a very moral conservative either. Then maybe that's the
problem. Reagan and Thatcher to be conservatives when in fact they were economic and social liberals. And never did a conservative thing in their long lives, as far as I can see. And that confusion has been one of the most damaging confusions around, because it's allowed people to accept political parties and other things as conservative, which simply are not. And then be disappointed when they find that the world is pretty much as it was before.
Well, maybe moral conservatism has had its day, and maybe there is no such thing.
I was accused of being a populist on Twitter this morning, and I replied that I am actually and always have been an unpopulist. What I believe in can't ever possibly happen.
No,
but I still think it would be better if it did, and I'm going to carry on saying that it should. maybe eventually it'll come round again.
Speaking of conservatives who are not morally conservative, let's talk about Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, because on Wednesday, I don't know whether you feel that this is an important point in history.
It goes right by me. It's one of those controversies of the week on the menu, which I think, actually, I'd rather have the fish and chips if you wouldn't mind. It doesn't do anything for me. Dominic Cummings, it's versus Al Johnson.
How would you describe him? How would you describe Dominic Cummings in a conservative manner?
Well, I've seen no sign of any conservatism in Dominic Cummings. But I'm afraid I was slightly blinded to any joys and wonders he might have by the first time I met him, when I conceived such a strong dislike for him that I've never really been able to see him straight ever since. But no, I don't. I don't think that he is what you would call a moral and social conservative. I don't think he's a driving force.
No.
And the way in which we left the European Union very much under his leadership and guidance is very much an ultra liberal free trade. Let's have lots of Australian beef departures from the European Union, rather than the one that I wanted, which would have restored our national sovereignty.
Yes, I'm not all that comfortable with those who paint him as this kind of great architect of society and, a man that should be listened to in all matters. I'm not sure that he's not just a bit of an oddball, to be honest.
You may be onto something. I'm so blinded by personal prejudice.
No, well, good. Well, let's finish up with your piece about inflation, which I found fascinating, because of course many people won't remember what it was like back in those days when you suddenly found yourself with equity in a home that was worth less than the money you'd put into it, and a mortgage rate that was running at 15%, and you fear that maybe inflation and crazy inflation may return.
I can't see how it can't return. Because so much fake money has been created. Now, people say this has been done before in what's been called quantitative easing, QE. But in that case, the money was kept pretty much in the banking system. What's happened with Rishi Sunak is that he's got a dump truck and spread money right throughout the economy, and particularly in the pockets of people who have, for the most part, in the past few months, been unable to spend it. But it's actually leaking into the real economy, where people buy consumer goods and spend on holidays. And when that happens, and the goods available remain pretty much on the same level, and there's more money chasing them, there's only one thing that happens: the prices go up. And I think that it's pretty much inevitable. If you've been foolish enough to abide by the rules of the previous centuries and save for a rainy day, then you've been punished by self-inflation for many years, because no interest is paid on savings now. So they are debauched year by year. You lose a huge chunk of them in an inflation which never seems to feature in any figures. That's another thing. I mean, inflation figures are designed by governments, and they're partly designed to prevent themselves getting large pay demands from public service unions. So they don't want those inflation figures to show an awful lot of things which go on, which is why I joked at the weekend that the inflation figures seem to be based on the prices of imported trousers, buttons, and custard, rather than.
Well, they do seem to move things in and out of the so-called basket of stuff, don't they?
It's not just what they put in the basket; it's the weight they give it. And it just seems to me, and you go into the shop and you buy a bottle of wine or a loaf of bread or whatever it happens to be. It's more expensive now by a considerable amount than it was a couple of years ago. But the inflation figures, inflation's only around about 2%. Right. Well, if inflation was at 2%, why has this bottle of wine gone up by £3?
Right.
Which is a good deal more than 2% on top of what it used to cost. And I find this again and again. There doesn't seem to be any real relationship between the official figures and what I experience in life.
But isn't that kind of
sooner or later it won't be possible to hide it anymore?
Yeah.
With massaged figures, all politically. This is Hitchens' first law of politics. All politically sensitive figures are massaged. They just are. You can assume it, and this has very much been the case in the recent COVID affair as well. And there are many people who are extremely skilled at massaging figures, and unless you're very suspicious, it will go past you.
Yes, but this is
what happens, and it's happening with inflation. But sooner or later, it becomes impossible to pretend to people that the value of the pound in their pocket, as Harold Wilson so merrily put it, is remaining the same.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all you've got to do is look at something like council tax, where, you know, a few years ago you were paying several £100s less a year than you are now. And it's sort of just kind of crept up and up and up. And everything has crept up and up and up. I can't think of anything that's actually got cheaper, really.
I think so. Imported clothes got cheaper for a while, imported electronic goods, and that held.
I mean, televisions have got cheaper, I would say. Because, for example, I mean, I remember buying my first, you know, flat screen TV back in 2005. I'd just been fired by the Daily Mirror, and I thought this is a good time to buy a flat screen TV. And it was a 32-inch flat screen television from Sony, I think, bought for £1,000. You know, you can now buy one of those for about 150 quid.
Well, yeah, there are things which go down. By the way, you weren't fired from the Daily Mirror for not being a woman, were you?
No, I was fired from the Daily Mirror because Piers Morgan was fired ahead of me, and I was thought to be one of his cohorts. So they moved me out. Very sharpish, I'm afraid.
Well, I'm not sure which is worse, really.
I know, it's true.
There are some things whose prices have fallen, and sometimes the price of oil falls. It's not doing that at the moment, and that will have a fairly considerable impact. But in general, the upward trend in the cost of oil, particularly now that it's fairly verging on compulsory to put your children through university, which many people used not to do. The cost of doing that is colossal. You say, all right, so you borrow a lot of the money to do it. Even so, the parents of children at university do incur costs, and they go up all the time. Those universities are fantastically greedy businesses, as far as I can see. So there's that too has entered into people's lives. But the real thing is that the other thing is the price of houses is now so ridiculous. I don't know anybody, because I don't know any billionaires. I don't know anybody who could afford the house they currently live in if they had to pay for it now.
Yes.
The prices are absurd. So how are these prices maintained at this level? They're maintained at this level because houses are an asset, and therefore people stuff their money into them to try and protect it from the inflation we pretend isn't going on. Well, tell me what that means.
Yes. It's a fascinating thing, actually. We must talk about this some more because, unfortunately, we're out of time. Peter, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday Columnist, with a lot of very interesting arguments to make.